Alister McGrath responds to Dawkins' views, Richard Dawkins' views, on the relationship between science and religion, and the conclusion that Dawkins draws that one should be an atheist, given what we learn from science. Now, Dawkins starts with evolution, and McGrath says that Dawkins considers Darwinism or some kind of naturalistic evolution not so much as a scientific theory, but rather as a worldview, some big, universal, timeless principle that then is capable of being applied throughout the universe, so in all kinds of disciplines. And it's certainly the case that not merely is evolution applied in biology, but a lot of natural scientists start to apply evolution to their thinking about psychology and sociology and philosophy. And this is the case with Dawkins. For Dawkins, that is, his evolutionary theory is this grand narrative that then provides a framework for thinking about anything and everything. Now, McGrath is critical of this because that means he's using a worldview to draw conclusions that he claims comes from science. Now, there are other views that very prominent scientists hold. So McGrath points out that there's disagreement among scientists about the relationship between science and religion. So for example, Francis Collins of the Human Genome Project, extremely influential and brilliant scientist, argues that natural science creates a positive presumption of faith. Of course, it's mixed. Stephen Jay Gould argues that there are negative implications for faith, but he also maintains that science simply cannot adjudicate the issue of God's existence. A more common view is not atheism, but agnosticism. And even T.H. Huxley, a prominent atheist who was a defender of Darwin and took Darwin's views into scientific naturalism, thought that questions about God simply cannot be settled on the basis of the scientific method. And that is, in fact, the generally accepted position. The views of Gould and Huxley in that claim, at least, are commonly accepted that science is not going to resolve the issue of whether or not God exists. For Dawkins, of course, as a scientist, he claims to hold to the scientific method, and he admits in some places that science cannot disprove the existence of God, but he also claims that religion is merely a matter of pure individual inclination, and since any rational belief must be verified by the scientific method, then it's irrational to believe in God. Now, McGrath responds to this by saying that although the scientific method cannot resolve the issue of God's existence, and again, nearly everyone agrees that it cannot, there are other reasoned and principled methods of argumentation that should be used to address the issue. Other methods besides the scientific method. And I just would add that the scientism that Dawkins endorses fails. You could see my video on scientism for a review of why I think that is the case. Now, McGrath says that God's existence is underdetermined by the evidence. The evidence does not lead one to one view or another regarding God. So this is similar to a Bohm versus a Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics. So at issue there is whether a subatomic particle actually follows a specific path in its movements. And so one interpretation says they do, another says they do not, but the two are empirically equivalent. They make the same predictions. You would get the same results using both interpretations. So that's a case of science not being able to say whether one is accurate or true while the other is not, they are underdetermined. And in such cases, it doesn't mean we abandoned rationality on the issue. We don't do that. And it also does not mean there is no truth to the matter, right? It still could be true that subatomic particles follow a specific path, or it could be false that they do. It's just that our current interpretations are equally satisfactory in describing what's going on and prediction and explanation, and so we just don't know. There are other epistemological questions that are relevant for Dawkins and his views about religion. So a big, broad epistemological question would be, what conditions must be fulfilled before a belief is justified? And it seems like Dawkins' answer is only those beliefs justified by the scientific method are ones that are rational. Any other belief is irrational, or at the best, non-rational. But not only is that view inaccurate, again, that's a scientism of sorts, Dawkins himself does not consistently adhere to those standards. And McGrath says that Dawkins' treatment of theology is superficial and inaccurate. It's something that only the theologically illiterate would be impressed by. And McGrath adds that Dawkins' enthusiastic rejection of religion is based on a bad epistemology. McGrath says that Dawkins is inconsistent in a few different ways. One is that he often systematically puts opposing views in the most naive way possible, and then mocks and demonizes the straw man that he creates. This is the straw man fallacy, and Dawkins seems to be guilty of it in several places, says McGrath. For example, consider his definition of faith. And this is a quote from Dawkins, where he says, faith is blind trust in the absence of evidence, even in the teeth of evidence. And he goes on in the second edition of Dawkins' book, The Selfish Gene, he claimed that faith is a kind of mental illness. Faith is an excuse to evade the need to think, to evade the need to evaluate evidence. And he goes on for kicks and says faith's one of the great evils of the world, and it's comparable to smallpox, but much harder to eradicate. Okay, that's what Dawkins has to say about faith. The problem is Dawkins does not provide any arguments for his view of faith. He cites no authorities for his definition of faith. And theologians simply do not describe faith the way that Dawkins does. Few, if any, major Christian writer has ever described faith in this way. McGrath mentions Kierkegaard may come close in places, but even he doesn't really fit it. And nearly unanimously from other writers, this is not the way faith is viewed. Dawkins compares faith in God with faith in Santa Claus or the tooth fairy. Now, that would be faith in the teeth of evidence, but one problem with this analogy, just one problem, is that many people come to faith in God in their adulthood, and many intelligent people come to faith in God in their adulthood. And even philosophers as prominent as Peter van Inwagen, for example, became a believer in adulthood. I am confident Peter van Inwagen would not be a believer in the tooth fairy. And that is quite a significant contrast. An issue that McGrath brings up is whether it's more rational to be an atheist or an agnostic. And Dawkins clearly asserts that atheism is the truth. He considers agnosticism as an intellectual cop-out. And McGrath turns this around and asks if atheism itself might involve faith. Now, as an example, Dawkins oddly and improperly defines faith as believing without evidence or in the teeth of evidence, but that describes his own belief in his definition of faith. So we have a tu quoque, Dawkins. You are using the same lack of irrationality that he claims his opponents use in this case. And the arguments that Dawkins uses to defend his atheism are simply not adequate to show atheism. At most, they lead to agnosticism. Now, let's look at one of those arguments. So McGrath lays out one of Dawkins' arguments, and he seems to, he's piecing this together from the book, an overview of Dawkins' writing, but he does have this laid out in a few short pages as well. And McGrath says that Dawkins' atheism certainly does not depend on science, but rather a cluster of apparently unexamined non-scientific values and beliefs. So how does the argument go? First, Dawkins claims that any designer capable of creating such a complex universe would have to be even more complex. Again, why that would be the case is not clear, but he goes on, a more complex designer would be even more improbable than the universe. And we have a third premise, either the designer is in need of explanation or he is not. And if he's not in need of an explanation, then he's inadequate to provide an explanation. So either he's in need of explanation, but there is none, or he's not in need of it, but that would be an inadequate way of explaining anything else. So either way, there's no explanation in appealing to a designer. Now, notice one thing about the argument is completely aimed at a teleological or design style of argument, and there are many, many other arguments for the existence of God. And so if we're saying that this is an argument for atheism, it's not really addressing the other arguments that are widely available. Now, how does McGrath respond to the argument? Well, one, McGrath says God could have created an environment in which incredibly complex entities could develop from quite simple beginnings. And in fact, Dawkins affirms that that's what happened. Complex entities developed from simple beginnings. The second premise McGrath argues, and that's the premise that says a more complex designer would be even more improbable. McGrath says that's really dubious. It's not defended anywhere. And it really wouldn't matter if God were improbable. I mean, Dawkins already argues for the claim that improbable things happen. So whether or not God is improbable doesn't seem to be an issue that should matter to Dawkins. So that seems an odd route to take. And then finally, about premise three, the either or premise, either the designer is in need of an explanation or he is not. McGrath raises this question, what kind of explanation is needed? So then he goes on to explore this idea of explanation that Dawkins seems to be using. So let's take a look at that. What is explanation? McGrath says the concept of explanation is greatly disputed, okay, just broadly speaking, among philosophers and scientists, it's a greatly disputed concept. And Dawkins doesn't make any attempt to clarify his own view of explanation. Not only does he not defend it, he really doesn't clarify it, says McGrath. None of the well-known versions or concepts of explanation and defended versions of explanation has the reductive sense that Dawkins seems to presuppose. And there are inevitably ultimate facts that simply cannot be explained. And scientists certainly accept this, and philosophers do as well. That's just a fact of the universe, that we cannot explain absolutely everything. This is similar to Aristotle and the fundamental principle of reasoning, which of course you could never provide an argument for, because you would have to use a fundamental principle in order to lead to an argument for the conclusion of the fundamental principle. It's somewhat similar in science regarding what exists. Now, McGrath says, why not think that God is an ultimate, something that may be described but not explained? And that is, of course, what most theists think. Now to the more direct topic of the relationship between science and religion. Dawkins has a common but mistaken view that science and religion are at war. They are at conflict, and that religion has always tried to hold science back. Again, this is unfortunately taught as common by scientists, especially social scientists, but historians of science have found that this is broadly mistaken. Scholarship, especially compounding over the last 100 years, has shown that this idea was largely a matter of Victorian propaganda, and religion has long promoted science. That's just a historical fact. Religion has long promoted intellectual inquiry. Now, certainly tensions have arisen, but McGrath argues that those are typically intermittent. They just rise up and go away, and they're often related to personality skirmishes. Very big personalities arguing with one another, popes and scientists like Dawkins himself, but from earlier times, of course, throughout history. Politics plays a very significant role. Other particular features of a culture play roles, much more than fundamental tensions between religion and science. Now, McGrath reviews the history. I certainly cannot include all of that here in this video, but he gives an overview explaining why particular skirmishes have developed, for example, with Galileo, and a broadly congenial relationship between religion and science generally exists. In fact, the university, the whole idea of a university, developed in Europe in a religious context, and ministers were typically the most educated people. That was also the case in the United States in our early history, that ministers were often the most educated people. They were often as scientists as well, or mathematicians. And the development of universities in the United States with religious basis and context include Princeton, Harvard, Vanderbilt, USC, Notre Dame, Baylor, Loyola, many, many others. Fine institutions that rose out of a religious basis. So there is not this conflict, but rather religion supporting scientific inquiry when you look at the history.